Papa is the best at it in my family. Storytelling, that is. When Papa tells a story, there's a sort of gravity that pulls you in. He evokes your emotions and ignites your imagination. You've been hooked. I remember one time in particular when Papa was telling a story about the African-American woman who worked as a housemaid for his grandfather and took care of Papa when he was a young boy. As he told this story, tears of remorse and sorrow began to roll down his cheeks as he remembered the life this woman had endured. As he spoke, everyone scooted closer and leaned in, and tears began to roll down their cheeks too. We all have storytellers in our families and communities. The great storytellers attest to and at the same time are keenly aware of the power of stories. The great storytellers know that stories have the power to encourage and to excite and to expand one's imagination. They know that stories can enliven community and create shared meaning. They know that stories are the vehicle that passes on collective memory while at the same time creating collective memory. Great storytellers are not the only ones who know the power of story. It has been evident to all of humanity throughout all of history. This is why stories are present in every culture across the globe and across the timeline. The power of story is why we all have a Papa in our family. Luke, the third gospel writer, is well aware of the power of story. Some have argued that in this particular text, Luke's awareness of a story's power are put on display more so than any other text in Luke. In this story, we're told that two disciples are discussing, or perhaps debating, the stories, or maybe even multiple stories that they've heard about Jesus of Nazareth circulating throughout the town. These stories have made their ways through the hallways and the highways of Jerusalem and have now arrived on the road to Emmaus. During the disciples' discussion, a stranger approaches and asks about their conversation. This catches the disciples off guard. How has this person not heard about these stories that have been circulating around town? How could he be so out of touch? How could he be so oblivious to these recent events? You see, the disciples are unaware that the stranger who seems so out of touch is the very subject of their conversation. The text says that their eyes were kept from noticing him. Why is that? Is it their own lack of faith? Is God keeping their eyes concealed? Is Satan exercising some sort of power over their ability to see? All of these and other reasons have been proposed. But Luke is not concerned with why the disciples can't see. Rather, he's concerned with the effect that their inability to see has on their understanding of the story. So what is that effect? As the disciples continue to interact with this stranger, we find out that they are walking down the road to Emmaus without hope. Did you hear what they said about Jesus? They said, "We had hoped he was the one to redeem Israel." Hoped. Hope has taken its place in the past tense. But there's a moment when it seems that hope may move from the past to the present. The disciples begin to share the report that they received from the women. When sharing this report, the disciples say that Jesus is alive. They've said it. The women's report has completed the story. Jesus has risen. This proclamation should move their hope from the past to the present. This proclamation should bring clarity to the disciples' confusion. This proclamation should open up their eyes to the risen Lord in their midst. Yet, the disciples conclude their story by saying that they did not see him. The story is ended just as it began. They still do not see the risen Christ in their midst, and hope remains a thing of the past. For all the power that stories have, In this circumstance, the story cannot make the presence of the risen Christ real to the disciples. As they remain in the dark about the identity of this stranger, hope remains a thing of the past. Haven't we all at some point or another been in circumstances like this? Circumstances when hope seems like a thing of the past, whether it's depression, disease, death, a destructive relationship, or utter disbelief. There are times in all of our lives when the story, with all of its power, fails to make the presence of Christ real to us. There are times when we are this unnamed disciple in Luke, walking beside Cleopas on the road to Emmaus without hope. As we near the end of Luke's story, the disciples finally reach their destination. Upon arriving, they urge the stranger that they've met to eat with them. As they sit down around the table, something strange happens. Did you notice it? The hospitable host becomes the guest, as the strange guest becomes the host. Jesus, this stranger turned host, breaks the bread and blesses the meal, just as he did at the miraculous feeding, and just as he did at his last meal with the disciples. And then finally, after several minutes and many miles, the disciples recognize the risen Jesus in their midst. As this encounter occurs, hope moves from the past to the present, and the disciples, full of hope and fueled by hope, run back to Jerusalem to tell the others that they have encountered the risen Christ in the breaking of the bread. That was the moment when their eyes burst open and they felt their hearts burning within them. The risen Christ became real to them when they gathered around the table and shared a meal. Are any of you familiar with the Liturgist podcast? Michael Gungor and Mike McHarg, or Science Mike as he's called on the podcast, are the hosts. On one episode, Science Mike tells his story of losing his faith and then finding his faith once again. Science Mike grew up in church hearing the Christian story, but then through some life circumstances, the story lost its power. Soon thereafter, Mike became an atheist. His hope in God became a thing of the past. One day, a friend of Science Mike's asked him to go to a pastor's conference and church leaders' conference. Mike said yes. While at this conference, Mike found himself offering a rebuttal to everything that was said about God. At the end of the conference, the speaker was leading everyone in communion. As Science Mike sat there, he went back and forth with himself, but eventually decided to walk the aisle toward the speaker. As he began to walk down the aisle toward the speaker, he saw that the speaker was looking at him with tears in his eyes. As he approached the speaker said to him, "Mike, this is an act, the way the Eucharist is done, where this is a thing that is offered that you have to take. They hold it out, and you have to take it." At this point, Science Mike says that he didn't want to take a piece of bread that represented someone he didn't even believe existed. So he decided to turn around and walk out of the room. And then the most surprising part of the entire story occurs. As he turns around, he hears a voice say to him, "I was here when you were 8, and I am here now." Science Mike says at this moment he completely lost it. He took the bread, dipped it in the cup, and bolted out of the room with tears streaming down his face. The risen Christ was made known to him in the breaking of the bread. And his hope in God moved from the past to the present. Do you still have questions and doubts? Most certainly. Which of us do not? But now he had hope. The disciples who met the risen Christ in the shared meal had a great story to tell. However, they knew that there are certain hope-starved situations when the story, for all its power, fails to make the presence of the risen Christ real to us. Therefore, they did not just tell the story, but they continued to gather around the table and share meals with one another. In doing so, encounters with the risen Christ do not end on the road to Emmaus. Rather, all whom gather around the table, tell the story, and share meals with one another can encounter the risen Christ who resurrects hope. When you find yourself on the road to Emmaus, a road marked with hopelessness and confusion, a road that we will all find ourselves on at one point or another, I encourage you to come to the table, pull up a chair, hear the story, and partake of the meal. In doing so, may you encounter the risen Christ, and may hope be restored. Amen.